So the title of my talk, as you might have seen, is Stardust Dancing. When Mike Tredavi, my partner, saw that I'd given my talk that title, she said, "That's really flaky." But what can you say? It seemed like to capture the right kind of mood for me, and it still does as I've been preparing it. So I'm going to unpack this idea of stardust dancing. On Thursday evening, Luca Bandhu came down to the Dharma Parlour area and said to us, "There's a man with a telescope up on the green and you can see Jupiter." So off we went, and indeed there was a man who'd got his astronomical telescope out and had placed it on the grass there in the village green, and just slightly to the east of the half moon was Jupiter. And for the first time in my life I was able to see Jupiter magnified enough so I could see its bands. And there too were its 4 main moons glowing in the sunshine: Io, Europa, Titan, and the other one, Ganymede. Thank you, Annabeth. Excellent. And of course they're 600 million miles away, wobbling through the lights, wobbling through space there, and they were shifting very rapidly because of the rotation of the Earth. And I felt very moved, I think because I've always wanted to see them. And it was a reminder of the vastness of this universe in which we live. But it's reality in detail at the same time. And of course Jupiter's a gas giant, one of these planets that wasn't big enough to become a star, so exists in our solar system as a sort of enormous ball of gas. But there's other elements in that gas giant. There's helium and whatever elements make up the bands. Do you know, Annabeth? Okay. And but of course inside the rotation of Saturn are the planets such as Venus, Mars and the Earth, made up of elements like silicon and iron and carbon. These heavy elements upon which of course life depends. So we're made out of these elements. But it turns out that these elements weren't present at the beginning of time. By no means at all. In fact, it took a whole cycle of cosmic evolution for these elements to develop. Out of the hydrogen present shortly after the Big Bang evolved the early stars. And it was only when those stars, only of a certain size, at a certain point billions of years after their first forming, that they became supernovae. It's only when they became massive explosions of nuclear fusion that there were the conditions for these heavier elements to form in the nuclear fusion reaction. Those elements then flew out and across space. I don't know the details. Formed then the beginnings of what then became our solar system in a second wave of star making, or perhaps third wave. So these elements of which we ourselves are made, oxygen, that's part of the water in our bodies, the carbon, part of our bones, all these other elements in different proportions, were all formed out of long dead stars. So you could say our bodies are stardust being recycled. So this life we have, to some extent, is simply the recycling of stardust. This, in a certain way, this is a kind of way of thinking that pleases perhaps a certain sort of materialist physicist. The reflection on we being made of stardust comes from Carl Sagan, actually. But I think it's a great starting point for a consideration of life and death. The miracle of us being stardust, being recycled in the universe. This is the big picture of what we are. So what is it to be alive as stardust? A way in to consider this is to consider what it is to be mortal. And that's been the theme, of course, of this festival, the dance of life and death. And so actually in this talk, I want to focus specifically on reflecting on death, reflecting on our mortal condition. And I want to do that looking at some Buddhist ideas, but also some ideas from Greek philosophy and a few other Western thinkers, because I think they really add something, although in the end it might take us back to an approach from the Buddhist tradition to reflecting on death. So I'm hoping you're okay to join me on this exploration. It's a little bit winding, but each stage there's ideas to chew on. So in the study sessions I've been leading here, we've been looking at some topics for frequent recollection that the Buddha is said to have recommended. And these 5 topics are: I am of a nature to age. I am not free from old age. I am of a nature to get ill. I am not free from disease. I am of a nature to die. I am not free from death. Then the 4th one, which is the one that I find strongest: I will be parted from all that is precious and pleasing to me. It's a very strong thing to reflect on. Then the 5th one: I am the owner of my actions, heir of my actions, born of my actions, related to my actions, and actions are my refuge. Whatever actions I might do, good or bad, of those I will be the heir. So these 5 reflections are reflections on aging, illness, death, loss, and then karma, to use that Buddhist term, which I've just translated as actions. The whole list is pretty much like the 4 reminders from Tibetan Buddhism, those of you who've come across that list, which is perhaps better known. So it turns out that reflecting on these topics really grabs our attention, because part of us recognises that this indeed is the situation. We're prone to aging, illness, death, loss, and we can't help but act. So they attract our attention, and it's kind of fascinating and slightly difficult to go into these topics for frequent recollection. And the one that I'll focus on today is: I'm of a nature to die. I am not free from death. When one reflects on that, what soon became somewhat clearer to us was that it tends to provoke a certain sort of response in our being. It depends what. In the Buddhist tradition, it's said that people tend towards either the view of eternalism or the view of annihilationism. The view that one is in some sense an eternal being. Perhaps one will just carry on just like this. So there's always time to do what one feels it's worthwhile doing. Perhaps the body may be temporary, but there's something longer lasting in us. That's one possible view people can hold. The other, annihilationism, is that, well, death is it. Death is it. And this can be linked with nihilism, the sense that, well, it's quite difficult to find meaning. Everything's going to end, so it's quite difficult to find meaning. So those of us who are eternalists, like me, reflecting on I am of a nature to die, has the effect, a bit like dropping something into a cup of cloudy water which clarifies it. This water becomes suddenly clear. The somewhat complacent idea that there's time for everything because I'm eternal in some sense, that suddenly looks like what it really is, which is a view which protects me from the fact that I'm of a nature to die. So there's a sobering effect of this reflection. Oof. Sobering and having the effect of bringing my attention back to, well, what am I aiming to do with this life? What's important to me? That's the thing. What's my values? And I think that's the main point of this reflection. But for those who have perhaps a more nihilist tendency, it can turn out that this reflection can be a little bit more difficult. It can prompt a strong response of, there really isn't a lot of point in this whole business of life. The sureness of our inevitable demise is such that it can prompt even more of whatever despair and sense of meaninglessness is present. So it turned out that we had to be a bit careful with this reflection. It turns out that it can prompt deep sort of responses. So in order to even benefit from such a reflection, one needs to be able to notice one's response quite clearly and then address that. So it could be that one needs to bring in a sense of balance into one's the way one reflects, to already have a basis of loving kindness, of metta, in how one goes about reflecting on life. Already have a sense of the value of life, what one's values are, in order that this reflection intensify one's sense of determination and one's clarity. So that very usefully came out of our discussion. So that was the kind of discussion we had in our study group, coming from looking at this Buddhist teaching on the 5 topics. But I'd like to go a bit deeper now and think, well, why on earth would we fall into these two camps of being eternalist and annihilationist in relation to the thought of death? What is it about the thought of death that prompts people to develop these views at such deep levels that they're not really even obvious until you reflect on death? And in this sense, I'm going to propose, and then give you lots of talk about philosophers who agree, that a deep fear of death accompanies us through life. It's an existential matter, as it were. As soon as we become aware, at some level there's an awareness of mortality in our being, and that mortality is terrifying. It's said that I think some psychological research has suggested that children up to about the age of 5, this is very much a generalisation, really don't have a concept of death. So the idea of, you explain death to a small child, it doesn't compute. It's not that they don't get it or something, there's just not going on there. So what it is to be a human being, to be a living being, isn't necessarily to already understand death. As it were, the awareness of it comes gradually. apparently for children of a slightly older age, maybe up to 12, they believe all sorts of things about mortality. All sorts of stories help them to develop some sense of what the significance of death, this fact, which they may at that stage begin to have experience of, grandparents dying perhaps, and so on. And you might be able to remember yourself perhaps your struggles to form concepts of death. I think I just accepted the Catholic view I was brought up with, connected with heaven and hell, or rather just heaven actually. Granny's gone to heaven. Thank you. Granny's gone to heaven. So then you're okay, aren't you? You've understood something about the situation. But of course there comes a point when childhood ends when these stories are less effective at warding off this kind of fear of death. At that point it can appear in our awareness a bit more vividly. I'm thinking now of there's a wonderful metaphor in the Venerable Bede's History of the Church. It's a medieval, no, it's before that, isn't it? It's Anglo-Saxon sort of record of the early Christianity of this country. I think this metaphor must come from the Anglo-Saxon tradition. Life is like. It's as if there's a sparrow that flies in out of the darkness of night, into a brightly lit mead hall. Flies in through the open window of this mead hall. It's a bit like appearing at the Buddhafield festival, I suppose. And in this mead hall, of course, there's light, there's laughter, there's drinking, there's eating, there's music, there's dogs eating the meat, all the other things that go on in mead halls in Beowulf. This sparrow experiences all that life and then flies out of the window on the other side, back into night. Just like that is our time as human beings. There's darkness either end. Either side? Either end? I say either end of that flight. That's a beautiful simile for sort of allowing us just to hold that sense of, well, life, we're familiar with life, but the dark edges are unknown. They're just unknown. We know they're there. That's all we know, isn't it? But in some sense, it's important for us to have a relationship with them, since this mortal condition is so definitely going to finish. Actually, the point of reflecting on death, according to the Buddha in recommending the topics for frequent recollection, is that recollecting "I am of a nature to die" has the effect, or it can motivate people who are intoxicated by life, who are heedlessly just enjoying, caught up with the business of being alive, to consider their actions, to consider whether they're acting well, wholesomely, in body, speech and mind. That's the motivation for this reflection. And I think that's quite useful. There can be an intoxication with this mead hall of life, such that we don't take in its inevitable end. I wonder if this sense of death as fearful is even all that conscious for us at a certain level. I'll mention now a Western thinker called Ernest Becker. He died in 74, so he's not quite sort of contemporary. He belongs in that sort of, seems like a while ago now, doesn't it, sort of 60s and 70s psychological social thinking. And he wrote a book called The Denial of Death, in which his main point is that a fear of death, a quite reasonable fear of death, because it's so unknown, is present for everyone, but generally it's so terrifying, is so terrifying that it stays suppressed. But nevertheless, it's present and strongly affecting of our experience. And in fact, it's the basis of certain collective social movements, which are attempts to deny the reality of this fear of death. So he traces the large-scale sort of social movements which attempt to establish long-lasting sort of new regimes that will solve all the world's problems. He locates their basic motivation in a suppressed collective fear of death. So, I mean, this isn't by any means indisputable, because it's based on a bit of psychoanalysis, if you see what I mean. But I find this very intriguing as a way of thinking about what's behind some large-scale movements which people get caught up in, which people get intoxicated with, which don't seem to really deliver anything that they're supposed to deliver, if you see what I mean. Everything changes. Large-scale social movements are very hard to sustain. I suppose I'm talking from a Buddhist point of view, aren't I? It's only individuals who can really transform themselves and hence contribute to the evolution, the development of society at large. And yet people so quickly get caught up in these bigger movements. So he points to fear of death as being suppressed. And I wonder if that's a feature of modern life. You'll see I'm putting out these ideas as I wonder, so that you can think about them in yourself. I was thinking this morning, where is this fear of death in my experience right now? And I don't think it manifests as necessarily as a actual emotion, because after all, we may not have a feeling about our death. Do you see what I mean? Because it will be the end. Nevertheless, there's a feeling connected with looking at the end of our lives. The sense that it's going to carry on and it'll end. It'll end in such a way that we have no idea what's in the darkness. And in relation to that really quite intuitive awareness, there's a response, some sort of shock in a way, some sort of sense of perhaps denial, some real strong sense of wanting to make sense of it and then struggling because it's not a situation that can be solved through thinking, if that makes sense. It's there in a much more direct way. So when we ask, well, what are we afraid of about death? Ideas may come to mind, but they may be more difficult to exactly pin down. And this is a bit of a different consideration from thinking about death. What are we afraid of in terms of the death of our loved ones? My father died 4 years ago, for instance, and I spent a lot of time with him in his dying process. And in many ways it was a blessing to spend that time with him and to have the opportunity to really see someone out with quality. Does that make sense? He died, and I'm left with a sense of appreciation and a sense of that. Well, you've probably heard this. There's a sense of mystery, but also sacredness about dying. And yet, do you know what? Since then, I felt like I've been punched by life, if that makes sense. There's a strong sense of it's not been like easy to spring back up and enjoy life. Does that make sense? It's been a sense of now I've seen how it goes. And this is how it goes, with my dad's death. This is how it goes when it goes quite well, if that makes sense. So, oh my goodness, it's not It's not pretty or anything. So that's a response to death of others. And that's another big theme, as it were, that we human beings have to come to terms with. But to think about the fear of death of ourselves is a much more personal matter. So it's that I'm interested in us exploring now, the sense of our relationship with our death. And although the Buddhist tradition offers these recollections, and it also, we were looking at discourses in which the Buddha recommends the practice of mindfulness of death. Quite powerful ways of reflecting on death. I'm not sure the early Buddhist tradition, at least, has passed on really good ways of thinking about, well, what is this death that we are supposed to be recollecting? What is its significant? It's more or less kind of left there as, well, you know what death is, so practice mindfulness of it. And this is where I think some Greek ideas are quite handy. I'll just talk about Socrates, Epicurus and some Stoics. So Socrates, you've probably heard of the name. Interestingly, he lived at more or less exactly the same time as the Buddha, according to some modern scholarly accounts of the Buddha's life. Is it 467 to 399 BC? So Socrates lived in Athens. He was a philosopher. We don't know anything about what Socrates himself wrote. He didn't write anything. So we only know about Socrates through Plato. But Plato wrote a beautiful work called The Defense, Apologia of Socrates, in which he records, or probably elaborates on, the speech that Socrates made to the citizens of Athens who were trying him for corrupting the youth and disregarding the gods of Athens. So he was up for trial for corrupting the youth of Athens. And in this defence speech, he makes the point that at a certain point he realised that the only thing of true value is living a good life. Everything else is secondary to the value of the good life, of, as the Greeks put it, virtue, arete, living well in the community. But Socrates realised he didn't know what the good was. So he started talking to people and asking them. And here's the twist. Of course, in talking to them, he cross-examined them and brought them and himself to the knowledge that they didn't know either. In fact, he couldn't find anybody who knew. And his conclusion was that this process of asking questions, of revealing ignorance, and ignorance of what's truly of value, was the beginning of whatever it is to discover what is the good, what is the meaning of life. And it's clear he came to certain sort of conclusions, but he didn't share them. So he was found guilty in his trial, and he was sentenced to death. But when addressing the people of Athens about his coming death, he explained to them that he does not fear death. He doesn't fear death because there's two possibilities. Either death is nothing. It's like going to sleep, except you go to sleep forever and without dreaming. It's either like that, in which case we won't know anything, or there is an afterlife, and in which case he will be in the company of the great heroes of Greek mythology. He'll be in the company of of Achilles and Odysseus, and that will be a marvellous thing. So he's assuming he's going to get to the underworld, I guess. So that was his explanation of his attitude to death. So he's not saying he doesn't fear it, but he was able to reflect on what are the possibilities. He knows what he's committed to, and he's willing to stick with. He comes to some conclusions based on his thinking through the possibilities that there's nothing to fear. So the philosopher Epicurus, founder of the Epicurean tradition of a little bit later, he took up this aspect of Socrates' thought, which is concerned with the idea that death isn't anything. And he proposed this as a way for us to make sense of death, to help with our fear of death, which we've been thinking about as completely inevitable and part of our mortal condition. We had this last time, I think. I was talking about Epicurus and pleasure, and it's a bit easier. It doesn't fit so well, does it, with the fear of death? So Epicurus put forward what he called a 4-part cure for the human condition. A 4-part cure, tetrapharmakos. Don't fear the gods. Don't worry about death. What is good is easy to get. What is terrible is easy to endure. So that's like the 4-part cure. It's supposed to be a set of easily memorable tags for you to bring into your thinking and contemplating. And then comes the philosophical argument. So there's no need to fear the gods because he's an atomist, and that means that the gods are just like us. They're far away, they don't really care. The universe carries on through natural principles. So we're probably also not fearing the gods, so we don't necessarily need to worry about this. But this second part of the cure, don't worry about death, that's what I wanted to talk about. His argument is actually just like Socrates's. If we think about what we mean by death, it turns out it means the end of this existence, that point of ending. Given that it means the end, and based on his atomism, then there's no chance of experiencing death. It forever, well, until we die, it's there as the end point of life. But again, just as we go to sleep and we don't experience going to sleep, and we don't experience not dreaming, we don't experience death. Given that we don't experience death, that fear of death is not reasonable, because it won't be something we'll actually have to experience. So it's there, fear of death definitely there, but it's not reasonable. And this appeals to our nature as rational beings. When you closely examine your feelings, you can discover, I don't need to fear death, even though there's that feeling that it might be something to fear. You don't need to fear death. The later Epicurean Lucretius, he's a Roman Epicurean, wrote a long poem called On the Nature of Things. He made a further point that when we think about death, we tend to think about ourselves stretched out, dead, maybe a corpse, maybe terrible things happening. Or maybe we think about our funeral and all the people that come and they're terribly upset that we've passed away. And we've written our will and we've said what we'd like to happen, and we imagine it, and so on. And perhaps then we start getting upset because we're not going to be there, are we? Lucretius makes it, I'll just read you some lines from his poem. So when you see a fellow who is outraged with his lot, that after death his corpse must either be entombed and rot, or be devoured by flames, or by the jaws of savage beasts, the note he sounds is false. Some hidden goad lurks in his breast. Though he denies believing there's sensation after death, he contradicts his premise. His protests are a waste of breath. He does not rip himself up by the roots away from life, but rather, unwittingly, has something of himself survive. So he's making the point that when we think about death, when we experience a fear of death, it could be because we imagine ourselves being dead. Now and that's completely nonsensical. Of course, other people will see our corpse and they will be upset, and that might upset us. But in terms of our fear of death, it doesn't make sense for us to fear something which we imagine as being a certain way. Does that make sense? We won't know about it. Our capacity to imagine anything depends on our being alive. So you can reflect on this. That capacity ends with death. There's really nothing to worry about. At this point, I should imagine there's a little bit of you thinking, is this really true? There's nothing to worry about. It's good. Yeah. And actually, some modern philosophers have made the point that it's not totally convincing, this argument. It shouldn't totally convince us. And one reason why is that for most people, their deaths represent the end of the capacity to do what we want to do. And most of us, at the point of our deaths, have not done what we wanted to do. Does that make sense? So death is definitely going to deprive us of something, which is the chance of fulfilling our desires. Unless, of course, one is a Buddha who's somehow become content without having desires anymore. So for most of us, it's quite reasonable to have a certain sense that death will deprive us of something. So in this sense, we might not necessarily completely accept the idea that death is absolutely nothing to worry about. But nevertheless, I think it's useful for us to consider carefully what is it we fear if we manage to notice this fear of death. And that in itself, death isn't something that it's worth fearing. Meanwhile, what is good is easy to get, and what is terrible is easy to endure. I haven't got time to go into the Epicurean recipe for life, but it's let's call it a coherent philosophy of how to live. Epicureanism, you may have heard of, is a form of hedonism, although it's not the same as what we now think of when we use the word Epicureanism, which tends to mean being the kind of person who's a connoisseur of fine things. Actually, the Epicureans were much more like renunciant Buddhists, if you see what I mean. They closely analysed the nature of desire and came to the conclusion that the most enjoyable life is one in which one really notices how sense desires never end. What's really worthwhile are qualities like friendship and wisdom, and it's those that make life truly worthwhile. But you may not be so attracted to the Epicurean philosophy for whatever reason. I've got an alternative on hand for you. It's the philosophy of Stoicism. This also takes off from Socrates, really, but in a different way. Socrates' starting point for his philosophy was the idea that the only thing that really matters is is virtue, excellence, living a good life. What else could possibly matter for us as human beings than knowing what is the good and living our lives towards it? And the Stoics in early Greece, they developed their philosophy from this kind of intuition, noticing that the world around us is one which follows natural laws and principles. We ourselves are beings born into bodies which follow natural laws and principles. We're kind of in a determined system. There's a lot we can't do about. We can't do much about. We can't do much to control. But we can investigate how things operate. What it means to be a human being, how to look after our bodies. We can notice the cycles of the seasons, the way physical phenomena unfold. We can see a kind of order in the universe. This order in the universe is what they called logos, and it's a kind of divinity. And according to the Stoics, this order in the universe for sure involves the possibility of human beings themselves coming into relationship with that order, as it were, becoming part of the divine mind of the Logos. It's a kind of God, if you see what I mean. So there's a sort of, would you call that a religious vision? It's a sort of philosophical religious vision of the possibility of human beings coming into relationship with the very workings of the universe. In Buddhism, we might think that knowing paticca samuppada, dependent arising, really deeply is a bit like that. And it's said that knowing dependent arising is a large part of what it means to become awakened. So for the Stoics, one way of practicing is to look closely into our experience, and asking, well, what is under our control and what is not? What is under our control and what is not, given this divine order? You could do it at any moment, really. When the loud music was coming, was it under our control to block that out? Well, it wasn't, was it, really? We just had to sort of put up with it. There was no point in us getting miserable or anything, because it was just happening. I think actually it was under Dharjoti's control, actually, and I trusted that. But I didn't have to worry. I didn't have to worry about sorting out that noise. There was no reason for me to be anxious. Take this to the next few steps. Our bodies are part of the natural order. They've been born, they work according to principles which we didn't develop. They're doing what they do very beautifully, you know, just digesting and growing and seeing and thinking and all those things that bodies do. But they're not under our control particularly, or at least the basic workings are not under our control. So the process of coming into life, dying again, is not one we can do anything about in a very sort of, in the basic sense of controlling our mortality. It's something that which therefore there's very little point in getting emotionally caught up in. There's a sort of fatalism about the Stoic philosophy. You just notice what it is you can control, what you can't, and you just don't worry about what you can't control. What you can control is what you believe about this situation, and therefore to some degree what you go on to think about in relation to it. Therefore it's really worth examining your beliefs. One of the great Roman Stoics is called Epictetus. He was an ex-slave, and in relation to death he said, "Will you realise once for all that it is not death that is the source of men's evils, and of a mean and cowardly spirit, but rather the fear of death, the fear of death. Against this fear then I would have you discipline yourself, To this let all your reasonings, your lectures and your trainings be directed, and then you will know that only so do people achieve their freedom. So for the Stoics, as possible, a kind of freedom is possible within life by coming into relationship with the Logos. This fear of death, which can so subtly affect our experience, is a kind of belief. Yeah, it's a belief that it's a bad thing to die, that this end is somehow terrifying. But it's possible to look into that fear. It's possible to examine it and to begin to think about, well, is it really worth fearing? Is that fear reasonable? Is that this belief that death is fearful, is it really something that I want to dominate my life in some underground kind of way? And in this sense, the philosophies of Epicurus and Lucretius converge in giving us the sense that this fear of death, which I'm supposing is present for all of us, is something that is by no means unworkable. Even if we feel it in a quite a vivid way, it then becomes something we can reflect on. And using these philosophical sort of frameworks, it's possible to reflect on that fear in ways that highlight how it's not really necessary to fear death. I'm going to do a quick further point, then come back to the conclusion of that. So the quick further point, I've been reading Yuval Noah Harari's books. Have you read these, Sapiens and Homo Deus? He's a very brilliant intellectual, I think, a kind of historian of the present, you could say. And I was really intrigued by it. He goes on a lot actually about what's coming in the next century is going to be a lot of medical technology and artificial intelligence which will prolong life. And he cites this guy that works for Google called Ray Kurzweil, who's a real proponent of the idea of life extension. Maybe through uploading a brain to a computer, maybe through life extension technologies of a more biological sort. And Harari just makes the point that what is this but fear of death kind of turned into a technological project. It's really been useful for me to think this through, that we can just sort of take it for granted, I think. Oh yes, the process of medicine is bound to sort of extend life. But thinking it through to the more or less indefinite extension of life, what will the consequences be? It means the rich people get to extend their lives considerably. It will create tremendous sort of social difficulties. And what's it all based on? I think that's his point. There's a sort of ethical concern underneath. And a Stoic philosopher, a neo-Stoic called Massimo Pigliucci, he picks up this same point and makes the argument that from a Stoic point of view, this is just not necessary. If we can come into relationship with the fear of death, then this kind of thought about life extension really doesn't become very attractive. If you think about it, the idea of extending our lives leaves less room for the next generation. And that's really powerful thought when you think about it. Do we want our children and future generations to have very little room to manoeuvre? It seems quite wrong, doesn't it? Let's get off the stage. Let's move on when it's our time. Passing on what we've learned. Surely that's a richer sort of way to live. So now coming back from transhumanism to looking at the fear of death, I think now looking at Socrates, Epicurus and Stoicism, we've got some ideas which we can now, as it were, integrate into the Buddhist idea of practicing a mindfulness of death. This mindfulness of death, by the way, just to give you a little taster, is the idea that, or it's the practice of breathing in, reflecting, my next out breath might be my last, and breathing out, thinking that might be it. Breathing in, my next out breath might be the last. I mean, perhaps we've all got friends who did drop dead quite suddenly, so it's not impossible. It's not impossible. But if you don't quite believe you're going to be that person, you could also think, as you breathe in, that's one less breath. And you can't get around that one. So what's the point of this? I think this is where I'm coming to a conclusion. It sounds like the point is to somehow come into some relationship with death. But I'd say that actually, I'm not sure really that's the point. That can only provoke a nihilistic reaction, I think, or at least if you're an eternalist, provoke a bit of a thump. Perhaps it's better to think that what this kind of reflection does is brings us into connection with the fear of death, which is real, which is can for some of us be quite a strong part of our experience. And then we're in a position to reflect on what is death. Now, I don't see why a Buddhist shouldn't agree with Socrates, with Epicurus, with the Stoics, in thinking that death is nothing to fear. Death is nothing to fear. Nevertheless, it's going to happen. Since you don't need to fear death, you're in a position then to reflect, death's inevitable, I can't do anything about it, what's left is, I can live my life well. If you don't need to fear death, you don't need to try and sort it out, it just throws you back on how are you living your life since you're going to die. What are we going to pass on to the next generation? What are we, how are we impacting the world around us, our friends and so on? What are we doing with our minds that are willing to live this human life with its inevitable end? So live your life well. We can be completely clear about this human situation as being mortal. And in that clarity, I think it becomes clear that we need some kind of coherent philosophy of life to then live good lives. And this is where this reflection on death, or in fact mindfulness of death, can help us turn towards the Dharma as a philosophy of life. Or it can help us turn to whatever philosophy of life works for us. This isn't in life isn't a Buddhist. Buddhism isn't the only way of living coherently. And it's this turn towards the Dharma, or a coherent philosophy of life, which really allows us to dance. Here's dancing as a metaphor for being fully present, having a body which has been you've worked with and practiced so it can dance. You're fully present, your thoughts aren't elsewhere, you're in touch with the nature of things, and in touch with a sense of beauty and appreciation. So hence I titled the talk Stardust Dancing, and wanted to talk about how a investigation of the fear of death can actually, in a surprising way, bring us into a full relationship with the joy of life. Thank you very much.